Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Benjamin.
And I'm Sean.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling, and where we believe that everyone can be a storyteller. Today in the Prime Material, story-driven world building. In the wilds, goblins. And in the tavern, what would you do if there was a surprise event? Well, thank you both very much for joining me. You are both return guests. We haven't had too many of these yet, but for multiple times, I think 3 now for each of you on our various platforms. So thank you all for joining us back.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's a thrill.
Yeah, happy to be here.
If you both want to just introduce yourselves for the people out there who aren't familiar with your fantastic content and let us know where you can be found on the interwebs. Sean, what about you?
So you can find me over at Paradice RPG, where I am the DM for our flagship show, Advantage in Paradise. And we have several other shows as well, with more stuff in development in the future. You can also find me here and there all over the TTRPG community, guesting on podcasts and one-shots. I also play as a cast member over on the Roll for Damage channel in their long-term homebrew Rise of Tiamat game. And yeah, you can primarily find me on Twitch, but I'm on all other social medias. I'm at Odo_Sean.
Beautiful. And Benjamin, what about you?
Hey everybody, I'm Benjamin. You can find my personal Twitter account is at ttbenjamin1. I do a lot of stuff. My primary project is I am the DM, editor, producer, etc., for the Lawful Great Adventures podcast, an immersive and very narrative Pathfinder First Edition actual play that has been running for over a year now. We have a very long backlog, and we've been playing for a very long time, and we're only just now in the home stretch to finishing up our first full campaign. A lot of exciting stuff going on the show, plenty of time to catch up. You can find Lawful Great Adventures on any podcatcher. You can also find us on Twitter at great_lawful. Some of what else I'm up to is I play Jaber Valjean on the Shared Experience Network's Star Wars live play on Twitch. That is Ripples in the Gray, hosted by Atomic. And that's a lot of fun. That's with like Babs the Bat and Lion from Lionhead, and oh man, it is. I love it. And I also play Red Iron on Roll for Chaos. That is Aetherworks. That's Aether and Steamworks. Roll for Chaos Twitch stream of Sparrows, which is a space pirate adventure using the Aether and Steamworks RPG system. And the person that hosts that is Ty Burris, who wrote the system. So it's a really exciting show. That's on Fridays. Ripples in the Gray is on Tuesdays. And then finally, I have been on every tabletop talk show. You just don't know it yet. I've been on all of them. I have just searched the backlog of your favorite, and you'll find me. And if you find one that I haven't been on, let me know, and I will hound them.
I didn't actually know you were on there with Ty. Ty is actually the person that designed our new logo that went live a couple of months ago, or whenever that was.
Yeah.
Time is weird.
Ty curled a finger on the monkey's paw. He actually has 28-hour days, which is how he's able to get so much done in the RPG sphere, because he writes, designs, and does all of the art for all of his own content, and then he also does tons and tons of content for like lots of other people in the sphere. So yeah,
that's awesome. Well, happy to have you both here to talk about story-driven world building. Before we get into it, though, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As you now know by now, the podcast has changed a little bit to a monthly release with more guests and just better quality content. We found that this worked better with all of the things that we were trying to offer in terms of trying to inspire new storytellers and really just build up this collaborative storytelling network that we have, and all the different written things that we're trying to do, and all of the updates that we're making to our Patreon, that we just thought it was better to make sure that the podcast content stayed strong. This is the first of the monthly releases. This is, of course, the May release. The June release will be airing on June 26th, with the early podcast available for patrons on June 19th, and the live listen for that, the recording session, will be June 6th. And we'll have more about that coming out in the coming weeks. But we mentioned our Patreon there. Be sure to go check that out. There's tons of new updates, weekly content. There's the weekly Relics release that we're doing, the bi-weekly Overheard release, the Dungeon Master's Corner with the one-page rules that are coming out once a month. June 5th is the next one, which has rules and stuff relating to interacting with the Far Realm. So we hope you check that out as well. But yeah, lots of fun things going on there, in addition to our DM's Guild content, which we are currently in the midst of working on 2 new supplements, one which is almost done writing and one which is just started writing. Sentient, which contains 10 sentient objects for your D&D campaigns, but it's a little different. It's not all weapons. There's only one weapon. The rest is like cool things like sentient boots and sentient kegs and a sentient wood instrument with a smoking habit. It's hilarious and awesome. It is just a total blast. And then, of course, Villagers is also coming up, but that's going to release in a couple of months from now. So, yeah, just stay tuned to our socials. Lots of updates are just as everything has been shifting here over the last month or so. We're excited to just get into this new phase of Plot Hooks, and we hope you all enjoy it. But yeah, with all of those long-winded announcements out of the way, let's dive into the prime material. Story-driven world building. I think quite possibly my favorite thing about D&D or Pathfinder or any tabletop role-playing game is the world building. Like, I love things like Call of Cthulhu, and stuff like that, where you're playing in the real world. Those are fun too. Obviously, Call of Cthulhu is not entirely real world, but it's Cthulhu things set in, 1900s America or wherever you happen to be placing the story. But I love just sitting down and building a world from the ground up. And I think that's a big draw for a lot of different people looking to get into role-playing games. It's just fun coming up with the history, the places, the characters, the lore, factions, rivalries, all that sort of stuff. It's just such a blast. But there's a lot of different approaches to world building. And I'm not talking about the method by which each of us specifically world build. Like, some of us start with the regions, some of us start with like the religions or with the technology level that's in the setting. Some of us start with the history and work from the beginning all the way up, like starting with a creation myth. But whatever you do with that, what I'm actually talking about is the actual purpose behind the world building. When we build out our worlds, what are we actually doing? We could have an approach where we're just brainstorming according to whatever method we're using, coming up with cool stuff and just chunking it in, and that's perfectly valid and great if that works for your group and the way you like to tell stories. But what I want to talk about today is a story-driven approach. And you even mentioned it earlier, Benjamin, you have a very narrative-focused campaign, and I know all of your content, Paradice is incredibly narratively rich. What I mean by a story-driven world approach is really evaluating things relating to the party and to their specific stories, seeing what the group, the actual people telling the story, want to tell as a whole, and taking all of that and thoughtfully world building in a way where those stories are enhanced by the setting, are pushed along, where it's not just something where we just throw random things in the world, but we're thoughtful about how we do it in order to make sure that we create an environment that is very conducive to the story. And I think that's something that both of you do quite well with your particular content. So I guess the first question that I'd want to ask for both of you is when you're developing the world building for either just, the minute amount of world building you do for a one shot, or obviously things for an entire campaign, how do you feel about this? Should world building be part of the story development, or do you think it's separate from it? Or what's your philosophies as far as intersecting story with your world building?
I think that's a really great question, because I think it's at the heart of this entire topic and your experience as a DM who's also a writer, because a lot of DMs don't touch a toe into world building just because they prefer to use entirely pre-generated stuff. I've never used pre-generated stuff as a DM, and that's not any kind of badge of honor. If anything, it's probably a detriment to my experience. I've read pre-generated stuff though, because it's great for inspiration for your own things. But when it comes to that line between story building and world building, a lot of folks might think like, well, this is my world, I'm going to completely create it, and it's there for you to explore. That's not typically my experience, although I do plenty of that. When it comes to the players, I like to invite them into the world and then say, here's your corner if you'd like to build anything. Like, here's your place. You can build whatever you want here. Here's some stuff I've already built that you can take and run with, or you can join in on or build upon. So I really like to fuse the world building with storytelling in a way where, I know that at least one of my players in Advantage in Paradice loves exploration. So he wants to find the places, while the other players, they want to already come from the places, and they want to be like, this is where I'm from. This is what I do. So for me, it's very collaborative. Like, I start making a world, but as soon as a player says, is there anything like this? And I don't have it, that's time to start building that place with them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a very different take on world building, specifically how it weaves with the narrative. I am a super low prep DM. I do as little prep as humanly possible. I'm talking like, if I do a half an hour before everyone shows up, that's like a lot of prep for me. My prep today was double checking a page number for an encounter. That was it. That was all I did. That was my prep for the week. So when I do world building, what I'm really focused on are the core mechanisms that drive how the world works, and sort of and guide the central themes and tones that I want to capture with experiencing the world. And I would say, if you're looking for someone in literature who I take the most inspiration from, it's not Tolkien, though Tolkien is, of course, the patron saint of world building. It's Isaac Asimov. And Asimov, in one of his essays, describes his process of story writing and world building as a process of designing rules and then writing stories within the confines of those rules. So if we look at the Robots novels and short stories, which are, of course, kind of his core claim to fame, he also did Foundation and Empire, both of which use the same formula. There's the 3 laws of robotics that we're all familiar with. That is... He literally says he wrote a 7-novel series and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of short stories, basically just using those rules. So that is what I try to focus on first. is I build the core tenets of the world, the rules that the world is governed by, and then all of the details, the places, the names, the this and the that, as long as they emerge organically from the rules and don't contradict those, we can build all sorts of stuff together without having to spend an agonizing amount of time actually building it.
Sure. So it's more of an organic process where it is the narrative and the world building are so intertwined that it's almost happening simultaneously. Like it's the world building is part of the collaborative process in the moment, because you have just outlined these rules that are being abided by, and everything else is just kind of being built out as you go.
Correct. Literally, I can even talk about specifically about Lawful Great Adventures. The show's, like some of the core tenets of the show. The gods are based on the major arcana from the tarot. There is no objective good and evil, because the divine elements in the tarot are themselves not good and evil. They are both. And the story that we wanted to tell was a travel story. It's an odyssey. So it's about 4 friends going home, which was very cool, because that means I don't have to build a whole lot. I just have to sort of like vaguely sketch the horizon and then only render what's directly in front of them. So actually a lot of the world building in my game sort of happens, I guess I would say retroactively, in that when I do something or change something or mention something, I have to stash that away in my notes or in my noggin or whatever, so that the next time that thing comes up, it's internally consistent.
I'm very familiar with the sketch that down, keep it in the brain. So that,
Yeah.
like that one GIF that I've seen all the time about DM prep, where it's that old cartoon where they're just laying the tracks down right in front of them and just in time for the cart to keep moving. I mean, I think almost every DM can relate to that, even if they're not building their own world. But especially when you're building your own world, I think you can relate to that, because I completely agree. Like that concept of like rendering is such a great way to put it, because that's exactly what it is. You know, I do a similar on the run world building that is somewhat born out of the player's choices, and then follows, like you said, internal consistent rules. It's funny because I think if you just kind of jump into D&D, you just jump into writing, sometimes you forget that you are making rules along the way. But that they just become so natural in your storytelling as a DM that you don't realize, like, oh yeah, I've created an internal logic to this world that's, you know, slightly different from what the Forgotten Realms or whatever people might be used to.
Yeah, absolutely. I can even give an example. One of the first things that I introduce is a metal called Einharrow. And Einharrow is a metal that has an oath ritualistically sworn over it, and then the metal is enhanced either when the person is trying to fulfill the oath, or if they're in the action of breaking the oath, the metal will actually punish them in some way. Very powerful stuff. Well, there was so this thing gets introduced as like a plot hook in a very early episode. 28 episodes later, one of the players happens to make a promise to the ghost of a saint. And so I'm like, oh my God, he just made a promise to a really powerful religious entity. I think, and so I asked him, I'm like, are you wearing anything metal right now? He's like, I guess my armor. Why? I'm like, okay, we'll see.
Yeah, things like that are amazing. And like coming from a home game in the homebrew world to a streamed game in the homebrew world was very interesting for me, because those rules became more real to me, I guess, in my story building. Because at home, it's like, yes, I hold myself to some kind of like writing, like consistency and logic to the stories I'm telling my friends over a few beers around a table once a month. But then once you're playing once a week, consistent story, you have to, edit for YouTube, these things, like you're like, there's a greater writing expectation, but 2, I realized very quickly, I was like, oh, these things that I developed in the world at home are like forcing their ways into forcing their way into the stream because they've become such pivotal, integral parts of the world. So, like, for example, in my world, in Aradun, kind of, you were talking about the gods before. Like, for me, like, the gods in my world are very much like, they're not immortal. They can be killed, and they are, like, created, kind of like the Kuo-toa, how they create their own gods. In my world, all the gods are created of the minds of mortals, and because of the minds of mortals. Before mortals had sentience, they were all the gods were just natural forces. And then one creature evolved and went, I have a thought. And suddenly a whole plane of existence was born surrounding the mind. And the cultures call that the well of creation. And that, like, forced its way into the new campaign. And there's a whole bunch of stuff with rifts and portals to other realms that have to do with energy generation, that I was like, I didn't know that this was all going to drag itself back into this game that I thought I was kind of getting a small, fresh start with. No, Sean, you created rules for yourself, and they're coming back for you.
Yeah, that's one of the rules that you set for your world. But I love that distinction, because you have those. You've got, your players are playing in this world, and there's rules to this world, just like there's rules to Faerun, there's rules to Greyhawk, there's rules to any of the other pre-generated settings. There's just things that this is how X, Y, and Z work in this particular setting. But then the rest of the world building is player centric. Like, it's not just about the choices that they make, but it's building, based off of the players' backstories and the things that the players do in game or have already done, and making those choices to actually ask ourselves when we're creating something, whether that's on the fly or in preparation for a session, or just as you're starting out, maybe planning an arc. You ask yourself that extra question of how does this benefit the story? How does this interact with my players? So there's kind of almost like those two levels with it, of how you are reacting and building stuff surrounding the party's actions and the party's stories, versus just the overarching world building. This is how the world works.
Sean, I think you should comment on this one, because you're the master at this. This is like the thing that you are big for.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that the key term there is the world building becomes player centric, and you're right, beyond those choices. So whenever my players are, bounding towards a new arc, so in my home games, arcs take thousands of years of real time. It takes so long for my players, not just because we play less than you do in a weekly show, but just there's no restrictions on time and all of that. You don't feel the obligation to withhold the entertainment value of it, so they could just do ridiculous things. So it takes a very long time. So when I started streaming, I had to transition to being a little bit more quick with the arcs and fluid with them. And what helps is just, you got to react to your players and what they want to do and what their characters are. Your job as the DM then is to make interesting options in front of them that are part of the world. Because you could throw interesting options at them that are just encounters. You could just be like, there is a dungeon over there. There is a cave over there. There is a griffin that needs killing or something. But then you take where they want to go and say, okay, there's a griffin that needs killing. That's what they chose out of those three. All right, why does this griffin need killing? What is its relationship to its local environment? What is interesting about this that's going to make an interesting story that's not just going to be fun for the players, but also is going to then make the players feel like they did something in the world. They affected it in some way. And even the smallest of quests should be doing this. A little side quest where they go and defeat some local bullywugs that are messing with the town should have some reverberation in that town if they ever come back to it. So it's really, it's not just making their choices matter in the sense of where their story goes, but it's taking their choices and how it matters to the world's entire structure.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Do you do much backstory weaving? I think I see a lot of like you really get the backstories in there too.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's my bread and butter is taking the players' backstories and so like it depends on the players. So it's different across the board with the players in Paradise RPGs show. Whenever Shannon makes a new character, like that's me and her sitting late at night on Discord, ripping that character apart and finding every detail of their life. Like she recently just had a new character, and we've been spending the last week just creating and weaving that character into the world in a way that she could feel jumping into it. She already belongs there. Even with it, like creating like whole cloth, there's a monk order now that didn't exist before. It did not exist before in Aradun, and now it does, because we wanted to weave that in. And my goal is always that the player steps into session one and beyond just the regular jitters, they at least feel like their character belongs there and belongs in this world. Sure. So, and the level of that weaving in with the story of the arc or the campaign depends. So, Stefan's character, Curon, is heavily woven into the world. And I think I have that probably is because Stefan's also a DM typically. So when he came in, he was like, how can my character help your story? So our conversation was a little different. Shannon's was very much how can her character belong in this world? Stefan's was very much how can my character belong within your campaign, in your arcs, which is a very interesting experience. And then we've got Clayton, who created created everything whole cloth for his, and I kind of was like, sure, this now exists in the world.
That's awesome. Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think the broad brush takeaway from conversations like this is especially when we're first getting out into DMing, and we like me, we love world building. Some of us read Tolkien and started trying to write our own worlds when we were 10 or whatever, and we were just like that is just the jam to us, and so we're focused only on that, and we just create all of these worlds and then just expect the players to fill out a character sheet and just be dropped into the world so that we could tell our story about our world. And not only is that not ideal in terms of creating the best story together, but it's also does a little bit of a disservice to the players because they don't get to focus as much on their particular stories and arcs because you're not reacting to them in that way. You are thinking first and foremost about how their actions affect your world and not about how they are being affected and about telling their stories together with them. And it creates a little bit of a different mentality. And it almost just goes back to the fact that, I mean, I think it's kind of just impossible to create story-driven worlds without knowing the characters that are going to be played in it. Like, you could create the world, but to actually run the campaign, you've got to know the characters that are there and pay attention to their choices. Otherwise, the only story that's going to be driven forward is your own.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the rest of the parties.
One of my guiding principles, and I've said this on a couple of other shows, is as a DM, the less you prep, the more the players can take over. As long as they know they have to do that. If you don't prep and you also don't tell the players that they need to drive the bus now and again, then you're just going to be sitting around a table drinking beers and not doing anything. I have a very different approach to player integration than Sean and I think a lot of other traditional DMs, because I think the reigning model is to really get like a lot of really good like backstory stuff with the characters. For the last, I would say, like 2 campaigns that I've done, including Lawful Great Adventures, I barely do any backstory integration. In fact, in Lawful Great Adventures, we sat down and we're like, okay, you're going to have backstories, but your backstories are you're teenagers from a farm town, and you're going to have living family, and you're going to be unimpressive people. You are going to be basically tabula rasas. And then the story, the backstory is going to be you on this adventure. And they're like, oh, that sounds really cool. And it was very easy for me because it was much less to keep track of.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this, it's like a globe-trotting adventure. So I kind of get to teach them about the world as we go. And I also don't have to worry about teaching them irrelevant things that aren't directly in front of them. So the thing that I really, really focus on is the consequences of the choices that they make. The fights they take, the fights they don't take, the allies that they make, the objectives that they miss, the just kind of the way everything swings. What I probably spend most of my time doing is reassessing after every session, like, okay, what choices did they make? How is that going to change what moves forward? What other agents are going to push back? Who advanced their goals, who didn't advance their goals, who did the players undermine, who might have the players pissed off and the players don't even know about it. And also, like, what are the ramifications of the unexpected thing that the players did inevitably that is going to have far-reaching effects for the entire, for who knows how long. A really good example, they get to this city, and one of the first people they meet is a bounty hunter named Killian, who I put him in there as a one-off encounter. He was hired by a local landlord to scare the party away from asking too many questions. And he was like a fight where it was like an ambush in like a little square. And it was going to be a cool fight, maybe a little difficult. And they talked him down, and now he's like a major NPC because they kept coming back to this guy. So now he's like a major NPC. He's even traveled with the party a couple of times, and he like started out as sort of a rival, then an adversary, and now he's actually their boy. They like, it's been like a whole thing. And so I'm always looking for, like, rather than trying to tell my story specifically, I'm just trying to like set the stage, and then whatever levers the players pull, I want everything to react in as organic a way as possible. And then I want it to continue to, all of that stuff to call back down the line. They should always be feeling the ripples of the decisions that they make as they travel onward. That's kind of how I build it, and it's very compelling. They make a lot of enemies. They make a lot of bad memories. They experience regret for impulsive actions that they've taken, and all of this other stuff. It's fun. It's a fun way to do it.
Yeah. No, I mean, and to a certain extent, it seems almost like it's building the backstory live rather than doing upfront, like writing things out and doing all these sorts of things. You're doing all this world building and these choices that these players are making on the fly, which is making it story-driven world building because you are telling the story and world building at the same time, and it's almost like you're writing the backstory of these characters and they're eventually going to get to their destination or what have you or not, and then they're going to have the rest of their lives, and it's just like, this is the world that we live in now. It is a different approach, but it's the same. It's the same idea of integrating story and world.
Yeah. The other thing that I do is I intentionally try to leave out as much detail as possible. And the players know this. These are all things that the players like know. And I talk about this. And one of the rules I have at the table is if there is something that you think is missing from either a scene or a map or a city or whatever, just ask me. Just be like, is there a this? Can there be an XYZ here? And 9 times out of 10, I'll be like, oh yeah, totally. Unless there's like a really specific reason why there shouldn't be. And then between sessions one time, I was kind of asking like, okay, party's going to have some downtime. What are you planning on doing with that? Warren Hendrickson, he pipes up. He's like, is there a library? And I'm like, duh, of course there's a library. This is a really big city. And so we kind of, he sort of threw me a couple of prompts about what he wants the library to look like. My wheels go a turn, and I'm like, there's actually 2 libraries, and they're rivals, and they're run by ex-lovers of each other. So it was just like, boom, boom, boom. Here's a couple of just interesting things. And that started from Warren planting it,
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love the completely improvised location and NPCs that happens when players, because I love that too. I'm probably less intentionally vague than you are, but it's more so just I had a blind spot and I didn't prepare anything, not because there isn't that thing here. It's just that I didn't prepare anything for that. Maybe intentionally, maybe not. And when someone, so like Shannon in one episode of Paradise was just like, is there a blacksmith in town? And I'm like, of course, this is the capital city. There's probably 17 of them. But she's like, all right, well, I want to find a blacksmith. So I was like, okay. And very normally people are just like, I want to find a blacksmith because I want to go see if they have any weapons, blah, blah, blah. I know that Shannon's character has a backstory relationship to blacksmiths. So I was like, all right, well, let's spin an NPC up here. And it was just meant to be a random blacksmith who had a pretty dinky shop that was a lot like her father's shop. And it's just me being like, yeah, it's a lot like your father's shop. Feel some things, Shannon. And then suddenly it's
feel some things, player.
Suddenly it's like, this is her favorite NPC she's ever played with. And I made him up entirely in that moment. And he was meant to be there for that one episode, and he's still a character that matters to them. She still asks other players to send messages with sending to him, and is concerned with his protection and safety, and has become a de facto father figure that was really just a random orcish NPC.
That literally happened. Oh my god, that happened with an innkeeper. In the first full arc, they get to the city, they get to this innkeeper at a traveler's lodge. He's the first person, and the city of Edema sucks, right? This we actually had a sit down, like the party sat me down one day and they said, "Look, Ben, this city is garbage. We hate it." I'm like, "You're supposed to," but yeah, we can talk about that. First person that's nice to them is the innkeeper at this place. He's like this big surly dude. He became a favorite, traveled with the party, and then spoilers, and now everyone's sad. Yeah, it happened to me all the time. He was not supposed to have that prominent of a role.
Oh, I had this 16-year-old kid who was just like, he was this half human, half halfling kid who was just he was get wrapped up in the wrong people because he wanted to send money home to his family, and he was just the kid who knew how to bind wounds for this group of bandits who hunted people who had magical skill or magical gifts, and the party killed that group. But they didn't kill him, and he was just sort of there at the end of the fight, not really knowing what to do, and suddenly for 36 episodes of season 1, he's just with the party, just as like the squire for the fighter character. And for the most part he's comic relief, but he was just sort of this lovely little character named Robert, who spoiler alerts for those who cared a lot about him, they're sad now.
Oh no.
But he was just sort of this character that I had no intention of being anything. I was just an enemy, really. But yeah, I love those characters that end up mattering when they were really just sort of like, just because they were nice to the party, or even if they were mean to the party, and the party is just sort of like, well, we're going to teach them a lesson. And things like that.
Yeah, I think kind of when maybe a point that we're sort of gliding towards gradually is that one of the best ways to narratively build on the fly is to pay really close attention to what your players seem to be having a good time exploring and what they're getting into, and just keep letting them follow the rope. Just let them unspool the whole thing and get down in deep as possible. And they'll kind of decide when they're satiated with that dimension of it. But there's usually, if you really flex your narrative muscles in your brain, usually there's no reason for you to try to like push them back onto whatever track that you had built for them originally. You can find ways to put the objectives in front of them while they're pursuing the thing that they're interested in, or the NPC or whatever, and that. I think that makes the whole experience more effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great thing to because I think a lot of DMs feel the natural urge, especially performing DMs on streams or podcasts, feel the urge to rush the narrative because they feel like the audience is not going to want to listen to the party futzing around. But for the most part, most people just want to listen to people having fun. And if your party's not having fun, then that probably why your people aren't listening to or watching your podcast or your actual play, because people look miserable or they look too serious, or even like Paradice is very dramatic in a lot of it. We have our comedy, but it's primarily a drama. But things like that, making sure that if the party is trying to unspool that thread, let them. Don't pull the thread away, smack their hands, and say, "Look over there." While they're unspooling, you might say, "Look over there," and they might go, "Cool," and keep unspooling. and you should let them, as you said, fully satiate themselves on that unspooling. I had a
Sure.
town prepared in a Paradise episode, and I was like, this town, I have it planned for them to be there for a full week, and to find out things over that week. And it was first day they're in the town, and they've jumped straight to the 7th day encounters, by just being like, I'm like one character being like, I saw someone I remember, I'm gonna follow them as far as I can go, and other players being like, we're not gonna stop them, like we could stop them, and me being like, I could stop them somehow, but I'm just gonna let them keep going. And it led to one of our best episodes ever, I think, and memorable characters coming into play in interesting ways that were organic, as opposed to me triggering the timer when it was supposed to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that, because there's nothing to say that their choice to not go down certain roads can't also world build for you. You mentioned that a little bit too, Benjamin, like the choices, that the objectives they failed or missed or whatever, those things can have, if you had them going to town A because you were planning on them having to save the town from whatever attacking it, and they just ignored your rabbit crumbs and went completely in a different direction, well, you don't necessarily have to just say that town doesn't exist anymore, and maybe you'll throw that encounter in later. No, maybe that town is just now gone because it's been destroyed by whatever attacked it. I mean, the choices they made have implicitly altered the world, even though they haven't even been there, and that's something we lose when we solely railroad, and sometimes there are important things that you have to direct a party towards, something that's vital, or they're struggling to figure out something, and some groups, obviously this is very group dependent. Some groups like being railroaded more than others. I have DM'd for a particular group that really liked having a definite, this is, tell me what we're doing, because I want to know this. And that was, I think, partially, in fact, the thing that we couldn't meet very regularly. And so that was hard to keep track of intricate things. So they were just like, I just want to sit down and have fun. So just give me a narrative and I'll play in it. And so we're not saying here that this is the only way to do this sort of stuff, but there is just something beautiful, I think, just to this story-driven method of allowing the players to really dictate the world build, or world build directly with the players, or world build for the players, or however those things interact in whatever order you do them in. It is really beneficial to me whenever they're intertwined.
Yeah. Actually, my group, the LGA group, they like railroading, and so I told them, I was like, "Oh, you want a railroad, huh? Well, how about this? All you got to do is get from the left part of the continent to the right part of the continent, and that's your railroad."
That's great, though. I think that's
travel
amazing.
east.
That is it. That is, if you keep walking east, you're on the path. But they like part of the agreement that we have at the table is that, like, I'm going to try to make important objectives very clear. I'm going to try to make side stuff available, but not like I'm not going to ruin your day if you don't do something. If they happen to skip a hook, it is at that point that I decide, okay, either that hook didn't matter and I'm just going to save that content and use it down the line, or there's going to be a consequence for missing that hook. But generally what I try to do is I try not to punish players for not doing something. I just think I personally feel that's a little gotcha. And there's a very fine line, but I know some DMs really celebrate, like, oh, you didn't take the quest to kill the owlbear? Well, the owlbear is going to kill a whole family or whatever. I'm like, they didn't take the quest to kill the owlbear because they wanted to go raid a crypt or whatever, right? So let's not punish, like, someone else killed the owlbear. It's not a big deal.
I like that idea too. That's something that a lot of DMs don't do. Is like, I like the idea of like, there's other people adventuring. Like there's other groups that could take these quests, and it may be because I have that same instinct. I really don't like. It can leave a really bad taste in your mouth when a DM pulls a gotcha like that. That can be really just not fun. Like, because there can be interesting ways where, some players really love to find out what happened though to a town that they didn't help. So it's in the same way that I think all tables, no matter their perspective, sometimes they like to be railroaded, sometimes they don't. It's up to the mood of the day, of the session, of the group. Because there's definitely times when I'm like, as a player, I'm like, just tell me what's going on. And other times where I'm like, let me have some space. It can be, I'm sure there are folks who it's just very much like, yeah, let's just railroad straight through. But in my experience, it's mostly been like a mixed bag of how we feeling today.
Sure. Yeah, and those are really interesting points on the gotcha, thing, because when we talk about and we had an episode about this a few episodes back, about the differences between, I think it was called like consequences, not punishment, and whenever you handle it in such a way that it becomes a gotcha, that's definitely on the punishment side. That's like, oh, you didn't do this, well, this bad thing is going to happen. Where it's okay to have consequences for your choices, but if you're going to have, like, I think part of the balance, and there's a lot to this, but part of the balance is if there's going to be negative consequences to a certain extent, you don't ever want to overdo it, but if there's going to be never negative consequences to a certain decision that they make, and there also has to be positive consequences for other decisions that you make, because otherwise it's always going to feel like a gotcha.
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh, I've just, okay, you've changed the world in this way, okay, and every time they do, it means a town has been overrun by owlbears. And you're just like,
right.
well,
Every town,
and you're just like, and you're just like, I can't win if I make the choice I want to make. Then something bad is going to happen, and that's just that. You have to have the positive things in there too.
I have a way higher tolerance for metagaming than I think any other DM that I know. I don't care. I don't care. I really don't care that the players know stuff, because I honestly think that characters, if we're thinking very realistically, characters in an environment that are from a world are going to have a significantly greater amount of like context in a given situation than if you were to be in that moment. You would have a lot more context than the DM is able to transmit over to you. So, like, if it's a thing to avoid the feeling of gotcha punishments, I'll just tell them. I'll just tell them, like, hey, by the way, like, if you do or don't do, like, if you do this, then there, like, the consequence could be like XYZ thing. I'm just letting you know. Like, if that's the choice you want to make, you get the feeling that this might happen. Or, if you decide not to kill that owlbear, you get the feeling that if someone else doesn't do it, like, that owlbear could threaten XYZ thing. And then sometimes the players are like, you know what? This crypt thing seems more important. I am comfortable with these consequences.
I think that's a really good call there, is because, like, I agree. I think that people have, generally in my experience, there's a lot of, like, for me as a DM, I am almost begging for them to metagame sometimes, where it's, you know what I mean? Where it's like, because it's absolutely, that point is so true. Like, you don't have, as a real life person, the context your character has. You'll never have that fully. And I can only provide you so much, so ask questions about it. And to me, that's not really metagaming, or I guess at the end of the day, I don't really think metagaming's that bad. So especially in most people think of metagaming in combat scenarios, and that's especially a place where I don't think it's that bad either.
No, I don't care.
Because you guys have fought together so much, and you have so much time on the road that you would know these things. You'd know oh, he's gonna do that. That means this. But when it comes to those story things, being honest with the players about the consequences, like you said, I think is the easiest way and the surefire way and the best way to avoid that gotcha feeling. And I was going to say, because sometimes it depends on how they play it out. If they go into the town and the town is begging them to kill an owlbear and they're no, that's different than them being we heard about an owlbear and we're not going to go to that town because we've got other business. Yeah. And, when a town is sitting there, how the players decide their characters behave about it can also evolve those consequences. Because if it is a situation where we decided these crypts were more important and that we hope that someone else deals with the owlbear situation, is different from them being in the town and openly saying, screw you, town, or as opposed to them, there's different dynamics that I think could be very interesting, and being open about those consequences. If they're on the road and they're heading, they've got a fork, crypts this way, owlbear infested town is this way. You can be all right, well, if you go to the owlbear town, if you go to the owlbear town,
I'm just picturing now the red monkeys in a barrel, but it's owl bears, so it's just
if you go there, someone else might raid the crypts, or the threat of the crypts might get worse. I encourage that question of what will happen if we don't go there. That's absolutely, I think, important.
One of the organic habits that's come out of me running it this way is the party splits a lot now, and I love party splits so much. I love them deeply. So that's
some of the best tension comes out of party splits.
It's great, and then the catharsis when they come back and get to talk to each other about what it looked like from either side of the operation. I live for it. It gives me the warmest of fuzzies. I love it so much.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's about all the time we have today in the Prime material. So let's still take this world building thread and carry it into the wild segment and talk about some goblins. Here in the wilds. Today's monster, goblins. And, goblins have kind of become kind of the thing to include in just about any fantasy TTRPG. At lower levels, they're just kind of the tropey minion level thing that you would fight against in most cases. They've reached just this level in pop culture where that general concept of a goblin can be found in so many different kinds of stories. But I wanted to talk about them in this podcast because they're just a good creature to include for this discussion because they're so malleable. They're portrayed in so many different ways. And so when we think about story-driven world building, this can also apply to the directions where we take our tropey creatures. And I'm a big Magic the Gathering player, and when you look at the different planes of existence in Magic the Gathering, most of them have goblins, but they're so different, and some are just slightly different, but then there's just some that are just completely different than other planes, because you have these individual worlds where they have all evolved over time, and they have different aspects to them. You've got ferocious goblins, you've got comic relief goblins, you've got these larger goblins, you've got tiny little, goofy goblins. And each setting, or even sometimes goblins within different areas of the same settings, they're different from each other. And so you could use creatures like this, which are tropey, and kind of take them in different ways to world build and add a little bit of variety, because you can kind of twist some knobs and end up with a creature that is kind of surprising to the party, because they're like, they've seen so many goblins, and now all of a sudden there's this goblin. Oh, but goblins here are scholars, and you're just like, this is completely different than my perceptions, and you could just really interestingly world build with tropey creatures like this. So have any of you used goblins in any of your campaigns?
Funnily enough, goblins have always been in my games. Like, they've existed. They have not come up that often, though, actually. So maybe it's because I found in my two main campaigns that I'm DMing for, I've placed the goblins unintentionally very far from where the characters started. And maybe that's because I don't tend to use goblins as kind of the the typical like low level cannon fodder. I don't really use them that way that often. I much more frequently use like beasts in low level cannon fodder sort of combat. Goblins, I've always placed them. Goblins have also always been a playable race in all of my campaigns. So like in my original game, goblins didn't show up that often because I was like, they're from the Arctic. The goblins are from the Arctic, and we're not in the Arctic right now. Similarly with drow.
That's very cool.
So like drow in my games are Arctic. They live in the mountains. There's no Underdark drow. There may be some Underdark drow, but for the most part, drow live up in the mountains, and so do the goblins, really. And they haven't come up that often. It's only recently that goblins have really come up in one of my games, and that's because in the new continent in my world, in the stream game on Paradice, there are goblins that live in that don't live up in the Arctic, that live down in the southern portions of the world, and they're just about getting there as a party just now. I introduced my first goblins a couple sessions ago, and primarily in the last session of Paradice, actually. And the goblins here are particularly good at like beast taming, and they have they've got a survivalist mentality because of the environment they've been in, but they're also much more collaborative than you'd think of typical goblins being. They also all have Skyrim accents, I decided the other day, which has been very fun.
Beautiful.
But yeah, I mean, I guess I've always thought of goblins a little differently than... I don't really even think of them as a monster manual enemy. I always think of them as a group that exists in the world in some fashion, in responding to their environment, have evolved into their environment.
Yeah, and that's one of the things with this whole thing, is like you can move them into whichever direction you want, because they are certainly valid playable races. You can create them in that sense, and if you are ever going to give goblins any sort of level of intelligence and make them non-bestial, please do that, because a non-bestial entity has the capability of choosing for itself what it wants to do. It is not this societalist war machine. If you're going to make them intelligent to the point of that sort of thing, don't go into all orcs are bad realm. That kind of falls into some of the whole errors which we're starting to correct in D&D with the racial tropes, which are a little in how they've been handled. But yeah, I mean that's great. You've got goblins that are from the Arctic. You've got goblins that are beast tamers. That's really cool. It's just like everybody knows what a goblin is, and then you're just like, hey, well, in here, this goblin is this. These goblins are this. And that's just really cool. That's what makes them so fascinating to me, is they're so flexible, because everyone knows what a baseline goblin is. So it's really impactful whenever you say that this is a baseline goblin with these things too. And it just makes it so impactful whenever you build like that race in your world.
Yeah, I'm also less interested in goblins as low-level cannon fodder. I'd much rather use, even orcs, trolls, bugbears, that kind of thing. Other sorts of bestial, I guess, things. I'm a big fan of gnolls. Actually, I don't know why. I just love them. I just love gnolls. I'm generally more interested in goblins as playable characters, as their own distinct and interesting and very, very alien society. One of the most important things that I draw from when I'm thinking about goblins is they have to be about as different from the rest of like human civilization or elven civilization as reasonably possible while still functioning in their own way.
Yes.
That's always very important. That's kind of a lesson that you can teach using goblins. So they might like infest a mountain, but really what they've got is like an anthill situation. Like everything is actually surprisingly well run because there's just so dang many of them. My favorite use of goblins, though, and this is from the Pathfinder world, the Pathfinder First Edition world, it is a short adventure path for new role players and beginners. It starts at level 1, and it's called We Be Goblins. And if you have not played it, even if you're a 5th edition person, highly recommend go and get We Be Goblins. It is one of the best introductions to role-playing for the non-role player. It is extremely well laid out, very flavorful. The pre-generated characters are hilarious. And basically, you are an adventuring party from a little goblin village, and you have to go on a little goblin quest. And it's fantastic. And there's like role-playing prompts, and there's things that you can do, and it teaches you how to act like a goblin. And I think that's super important because if you can learn how to act like a goblin, first of all, that's very impersonal because you just get to be ridiculous and stupid. But that also, if you're new to role playing, gets you the feeling like, okay, if I can act like a goblin, I think I can probably act like a half orc fighter too. I think I could act like a human paladin because the goblin thing was super weird. A human paladin is just, I gotta act like myself, but I gotta love Jesus. Like that's, So it's a great, check it out, find it. It's out there. It's very easy. It's a lot of fun. It would port over really easy to 5e, but honestly, I feel like you wouldn't need to because it's so low level that the differences between Pathfinder and 5th edition are like haven't fully decoupled at that point. But yeah, We Be Goblins. My favorite use of goblins completely changed my perspective on goblins. I haven't really used them as an enemy since then because I find them so charming.
That's something that I think a lot of folks, once they deviate from just using goblins as almost bestial enemies, start to feel about goblins, is that they are just they can be so charming and so interesting and unique. And I wanted to touch on something you said. I love the idea of them being alien. And I think that's a kind of hinting back to the world building again, is when you're designing your world, I love any time there's a unique take on a playable race that's somewhat different from the standard, say 5e race choices, where it's just sort of like, all right, well, you could be humans plus, you could be humans plus, you could be humans plus, you could be smaller humans, you can be, and taking it and turning it into something slightly different, where it's like, oh, goblins are a clear choice for that. And you can think about how do they actually play out? All right, goblins are smaller, so like the ones in my world in this region, well, they tame beasts collectively because the beasts are bigger than them and the beasts can protect them. Or though they're Arctic, so how does that affect it? Or even non-goblin, like wood elves in my setting, like very alien. They're not just sort of like nature-loving humans. They've got like bark skin. They've got growths coming off of them that are from the bark skin. They've got insect wings, some of them. In taking that to a race that's super malleable like goblins, you can do all sorts of things.
Yeah. Aether and Steamworks. Shout out Ty Burris. Aether and Steamworks does this really well. All of the lineages, I think he calls them. He doesn't call them races. Yeah. Because he's trying to get away from that terminology. But all of the lineages, all the different backgrounds that you can choose from are very distinct. Like right now I'm playing a Lesrin, which is basically a Dragonborn, but more dragon-y. They can't talk. They use a localized telepathy to communicate with people, but they can't actually talk because they don't have lips or vocal cords. So they also Lezerin society did not evolve because they evolved on a different planet. Aether and Steamworks is a pretty wild setting, y'all. They evolved on a different planet. Their society evolved without really, like, they have a very tenuous grasp of gender. So, like, all Lezerin, like, it's just they like the gender thing is way different for them, and the way they conceptualize it. So, like, you've got their two race prompts or two prompts for this lineage that are like, oh, this is a very different kind of creature. What does that look like in the party? And I think that is a role that goblins can fulfill too. This is a very different type of functioning, intelligent individual with free will who is just super different.
And that could be very interesting even for just the party to encounter. So, like, when if your party encounters a village or a town or whatever however that lineage collects too, like they might not have villages, they might not have towns, they might be nomadic, they might make their homes like hermit crabs, where they find something that's just big enough now, and then they go and find something bigger once they've grown. So, like, goblins in my world, they're from a place called the Fields of Glass, and it's a salt flat essentially, but it has these giant worms that burrow under it, very Dune-like. But these worms burst out of the ground, and they release a certain chemical that's so hot that they create strands of glass. Like, the dust that kicks up becomes glass when they jump out of it, and they creates these little perfect burrows that these goblins then make their homes in. And especially if the goblins can kill the worm, then they are like, this, we're staying here forever. But they get bigger and bigger, so there's bigger burrows throughout that they can call home.
Yeah, great creatures to use and to build, to add to your world as playable races and as intelligent parts of the societies in your world. Great. They've come so far from just the initial kind of folklore, perception of them from times of yore, so to speak, and they've become a really interesting asset. But I think that's all the time we have in the wilds today. Let's close out the show by our short segment in the Tavern. All right, we're out here in the Tavern for some refreshment. Today's quick plot hook: what would you do if there was a surprise event? And you might think this is much more vague than the normal plot hooks for the Plot Hooks podcast, and you would be right. But the reason I wanted to look at this is because I wanted to pick both of y'all's brains briefly. Is something that we can weave into the story is world building elements that set up for a surprise event. So, like, you set up tension between factions in your world building, and suddenly they break out in a battle that involves the party, or a person's been plotting things behind the scenes and the party suddenly finds them out, and there's a hostage situation that all of a sudden occurs. There's a dragon that's been scouting the town and finally makes their attack, and all of a sudden this world building that's been happening that you have placed behind the scenes, or as we were talking about earlier, maybe some impacts from some choices that they've made, all of a sudden just these hints that have maybe been popping out of the party, but they weren't really clued into it, and all of a sudden, boom, out there in full force, their party is caught up in a whirlwind of craziness where just this surprise event happens. Do either of y'all kind of use that in terms of, like, plot hooks for either just encounters or beginnings of arcs or anything like that?
I literally just did that. In episode 60 week, I guess actually 59, which is literally the biggest, most climactic thing that we had spent an entire arc building to, the siege of this city that the party was trying to defend. the siege gets interrupted by a dragon attack.
Oh, very nice.
An elder great worm shows up and decides to attack this city at its darkest hour. And not only that, this is an elder great worm that the party knew, were sort of frenemies with, had been working with in some ways. They had helped the party out a little bit. So the party knew who this dragon was, and they had pissed this dragon off recently by a decision that they'd made to ally with a different faction when the siege came up. So this dragon, now kind of out of allies, decides gets executed in human form at the beginning of the siege, and then shows up at the end of the siege in like full dragon form and just like apocalypses the entire situation. And then the party had to run to the middle of the city and kill a freaking dragon while they were already like completely worn out from the siege. And I had been building hints, like, because like as they're on their way to the city for this big siege, big moment, former ally of theirs attacking this city, like that was sort of heartbreaking to them, realizing that this person that they had helped bring to power turned into a tyrant basically overnight. Lots of hints going on, lots of like, okay, you know, Tyrese the dragon is making you this offer. If you do this for them, then that'll, you know, they might help you out during the siege. And they're like, you know what, we don't really trust Tyrese. Tyrese is a freaking dragon. Like we don't trust Tyrese at all. We're not gonna help Tyrese with anything. And they didn't help Tyrese with anything. Tyrese got pissed and attacked them. And they kind of knew it was coming, but still, the moment that it showed up, the moment Tyrese descends from a maelstrom in the storm clouds overhead, they're like, "Oh, we really screwed up, didn't we?" That dragon's pissed, and there's no way to talk them down. So yeah, I literally just did it. 10 out of 10 would highly recommend.
Yeah,
that is awesome.
I love the surprise event, especially ones that like they could easily predict or did predict. Even when they do predict it, it's almost just as good, because it's that lovely I know what's going to happen, but I'm somewhat uncertain if it's going to happen. So that's like the perfect place for entertainment. They say all storytelling, I don't remember the exact quote of it, but it should be your audience should know what's going to happen, but feel like it might not happen. And I can think of two examples of the times I've used this on parties. One that had like several hints leading up to it, and one that was a purely like visceral, they had no way to predict it would happen necessarily. The one where they had a lot to predict was towards the end of season 1 of Paradice, where they got to this town. One of this old ally of theirs was sending messages to essentially be like, hey, stay in my mansion. All your expenses are on me. Welcome to the capital. I'd like to give you a warm welcome, but I'm not there, so you can work with my Castellan, and they'll make sure that you're all set with everything you need. And throughout the week that they're there, things just start to slowly happen. They start to sneak around the manor. They discover secrets about this former ally. Security starts to get beefed up. They start to get followed. And they find out that the nation they're within is going to even declare war, going to spur war with another group that one of the party members is from, and is a noble son of a house there. So it all came to a climax in our season finale, actually, where the guards were like, "Hey, why don't you come with us? And just someone wants to talk to you over in the general's office." And they're escorting him there. Earlier that day, they were all talking about how we need to get out of here. And something's fishy is going on. And he goes to his room. The rest of them are being kept in there, the quarter of the manor they're in. And then they're like, we need to find a way to get to him, get him out of here so we can leave. Because they then, in that exact moment, got a message from one of the captains of this general. And the only reason they got this message is because one character throughout the whole campaign kept sending him messages, being very friendly and just being super nice to this guy, to the point where he betrayed their enemy to come help them. And he was just like, hey, he's gonna declare war. He's gonna take your friend captive. You got to get out of there. And it's in that moment that this character is having a conversation with this villain who's used project self to kind of do the hologram thing and talk to him. This entire week I've been saying, there's a teleportation circle in that room. There's a teleportation circle in that room. There's a teleportation circle in that room. And they're having this conversation, and I had the character slowly walk so that they were standing on top of the teleportation circle as this projected image. And one of the best moments I've had as a DM was have that projected image turn to the real character as he casts Hold Person on this one player. And an epic fight starts. It's one of those fights where they know, we can't get this guy. We need to get out. We need to run. And it was just such a fun time. And that moment of them realizing this is not just an escape. This is an escape from a big bad was huge. And then the other time it happened was we've got a character in the group named Timber who's got a little problem because he's a werewolf. And he's a werewolf because there's a demon wolf within him, sharing his body as a vessel. Recently, in our most recent season, he died in a fight. And it was this dramatic fight where they were fighting this battle mage who was also infused with fiendish energy. And 3 out of 5 of the party members were dead or unconscious. And the 2 that were left killed the enemy. They succeeded. And then they turn over and they see the corpse of their friend stand up, because he's got a Hulk situation where this demon wolf was like, hey, this is my body now. And it turned into this much more dramatic fight after that, which would have ordinarily been like, all right, we need to find out how to resurrect our friends. No, now we need to figure out how to kill our friend who's trying to also kill us. And it exactly like you said, anytime like there's just sort of this like head turns and the party's like, oh no, but in like the best way, like where they're excited to engage in that story.
Yes. 10 out of 10. As you said, would recommend.
Absolutely.
Surprises are awesome.
And you can catch them off guard with them too. Especially during downtime. You don't have to build up all of them. I had one where it was a downtime episode. 2 of the characters went to a hookah bar trying to get a little bit of information about this temple they were trying to find that was supposedly under the city. Alarm bells start going off. They run over to where there's a fire. There's a house on fire. And the little girl outside saying, my grandma's in there. My grandma's in there. And so they're like, they're heroes. They run in. And who's in there but the BBEG of the campaign, who they haven't seen for a while and didn't even realize he was in town, is there trying to kill Grandma. And it is at that they're like, what are we gonna do? So they get Grandma out of the burning building, being pursued by the big bad and his nasty beastie things. Get her out and get her to safety, and then like the episode after is the party going, what the hell just happened? What's he doing here? Why was he trying to kill Grandma? What is going on? And that was a very big moment for them. They really enjoyed that.
Oh
yeah, the surprise narrative plot point that's part of the overarching quest is one of the best ones, when they're just like, we're just here. Oh no, wait, this is important to the major quest. And, it's something exactly like that. Oh, the big bad is here. That's or anything that like where it's like they just were very casually like, yeah, we're here. This is gonna be a shopping episode. We're gonna just get maybe a little bit of reconnaissance, and then it's like, no. This is important now. Is really fun.
One of the major plot points or the major plot point in one of my campaigns was to do with my world, which part of the premise of my world is that it was sealed off from the rest of, like, the prime material was sealed off from most of other interaction from, the outer planes and the inner planes and stuff like that. And somebody was breaking the seals to allow, because they were trying to bring something evil from another plane. And there was a couple of episodes in a row where I was giving them the time. Like, I was telling them what day it was and, like, the time and stuff like that. And the players caught on and like, hey, why does he keep giving us the time? It's just like, and then just this massive event happens and triggered from hundreds of miles away, and this thunderclap comes rolling across the sky and this wave of energy, and they all of a sudden realize, oh, I thought this was a story about stopping this from happening. No, this is not a story about stopping this from happening. This is a story about reacting to the thing happening, because I had it written down that it was happening at 10 a.m. on this particular day, and so it was going to happen wherever they were, depending on how long it took them to do whatever else they were going to do. Yeah. And so I just kept telling them what time it was without, and then it was just like randomly the whole world changed with this random event. That was fun.
Yeah, I much rather prefer doing the twist as early as possible and then dealing with the ramifications. I think some people try to keep their twist tucked away as long as possible. Boom, let's get it out of there and let's deal with the aftermath.
Yeah.
That's like way more fun to me.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's about all the time we're going to have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you both very much for joining me again. If you both want to just quickly shout out your social media and where people can find you. Benjamin, what about you?
I'm Benjamin. You can find me on Twitter at TTBenjamin1. I am the host and dungeon master for the Lawful Great Adventures podcast. That is at great_lawful, a Pathfinder 1st edition immersive narrative actual play RPG that you can listen to on your commute. And I hope you do.
And Sean.
Hey, everybody. This was a blast. My name is Sean. You can find me on all social media at Odo_Sean, ODO_SEAN. And you can find me as the DM over at Paradice RPG for our Monday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Actual play, D&D 5e game. You can find that at Paradice RPG. That is Paradice, like the dice, RPG. And you can find us on all socials at the same handle. So if you like super narratively focused D&D and RP and dynamic combat, come join us. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you again both for joining us, and thank you listeners for tagging along for us on this exciting episode. Remember to follow us on all social media and check our Patreon for all of our updates on all of the changes which we mentioned earlier. And thanks for all of us here at the Plot Hooks team. Thanks from Becca and Izzy, and of course myself, Samuel. And we will see you all again soon on another episode of Plot Hooks.